Honourable members, West Australians. It is tradition for new members to use this opportunity to introduce themselves and to tell their story of how they came into politics. My story is short. I have no prior political experience. I've never worked as a union lawyer or a party staffer. I've never been groomed for public office. I come from a rather modest background. Having been raised by a single mum, working in retail and living in Rockingham for most of my life, I've never had any grand political aspirations. In fact, at just 26 years old, I may well be one of the least qualified members in this chamber. So when I stand here today, I do not do so in a haughty spirit. I don't say in my heart that my power and the might of my hand has gotten me this. No, I stand here humbled. Humbled by the task with the noblest of duties, that of effecting good government, of the people, by the people, and for the people. And I do so alone, with no fellow party members in this House to lean on. That being said, it is not the man that matters, but his ideas. And what I lack in age, I make up for in conviction. What I lack in experience, I make up for in principles. So while one part of me trembles at the responsibility of my role as the representative of liberty in this House, another part of me is comforted by the fact that I don't stand here today alone, but on the shoulders of giants. In my battle for the values of liberty, I'm not young at all. I'm as old as the ancient thinkers. In my quest for limited government, individual liberty, and lower taxes, I have the arguments of John Locke, who said, "The end of law is not to abolish or restrain, but to preserve and to enlarge freedom." When I stand in this chamber and argue for free markets, you'll not hear only my voice, but the voice of Adam Smith, who taught us that it's not from the benevolence of the butcher, baker, or brewer that we expect our dinner, but for their own interest, for their own regard. When I stand and speak in defence of freedom of speech, I'll draw upon the work of John Stuart Mill and his argument that if any opinion is compelled to silence, that opinion may, for all we know, be true. And to deny this is to assume our own infallibility. The values that I represent, and those of my party, the Liberal Democrats, are the classical liberal ideals of the Age of Enlightenment. We now often refer to these as being libertarian, which may be more suitable as the word liberal has gradually lost its meaning over time. In fact, modern liberalism is a far cry from its roots in the Enlightenment. Libertarianism is often summarised as being fiscally conservative and socially liberal, but it's a much deeper idea than that. Libertarianism is a philosophy that deals with the relationship between the individual and the state. Libertarianism, as we know it today, was the foundation of the American Revolution, and indeed the foundation of our Western civilization. Libertarianism is the philosophy of freedom. Freedom is best understood as the absence of coercion. F.A. Hayek, that great economic thinker of the 20th century and a Nobel laureate, described freedom as the possibility of a person's acting to his own decisions and plans, in contrast to the position of one who's irrevocably subject to the will of another, who by arbitrary decision could coerce him to act or to not act in specific ways. Therefore, to be free is to not be subject to the arbitrary will of another, to be free to live our life and do with our own person and property as we will. Freedom allows each of us to define our own meaning to life, to define what's important to us. Each of us should be free to think and to speak and to write, to marry, to associate and to worship, to eat, drink and smoke as we choose. When we're free, we can construct our lives as we see fit. It's freedom that allows us to live a full human life. Now, we need not approve of our neighbour's behaviour, but merely practice tolerance. to respect the moral autonomy of each person, seeing each person as the owner of his or her own life. It was John Stuart Mill who proposed that the only purpose for which power can rightfully ever be exercised over any member of a civilized community against his will is to prevent harm to others. To simply disapprove of someone else's behaviour is not justification to interfere in their lives or to use the coercive power of government to force them to live by our standards. A free economy allows us to produce and to exchange with others. Prices carry information throughout the economy about what people want and what can be done more efficiently. For an economy to function, prices must be free to tell the truth, free from government distortions. A free economy gives people incentives to invent, to innovate, and to produce more goods and services for all of society. That in turn means more economic growth and a higher standard of living. In fact, in the entire history of mankind, nothing has done more to lift humanity out of poverty than free markets. And to those who cling to romantic notions of a socialist utopia, I respond with the immortal words of Ludwig von Mises. Socialism is an alternative to capitalism, like potassium cyanide is an alternative to water. Let me be clear, I'm not an anarchist. I concede that the state has a legitimate role in protecting our natural rights, those being life, liberty, and property. It was the Enlightenment scholar John Locke who expressed the radical view that government is morally obliged to protect our life, liberty, and property. John Locke denounced tyranny. He insisted that a government that violates an individual's rights must be opposed. As a libertarian, I'm sceptical of power. The greater the size of the government, the greater its capacity for tyranny. As the old adage goes, power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Those who value liberty must also seek to limit the size and the scope of government, that the government might serve the people rather than the people serve the government. Thomas Paine warned us of this. He said, "Government, even in its best state, is but a necessary evil. In its worst state, an intolerable one." In the fight for freedom, there is much work to be done. I will commit my time in public service to advancing the cause of liberty, not just for myself, but for all Western Australians. When the onus of proof is reversed through so-called proceeds of crime laws that undermine the principle of the presumption of innocence, you'll find me making the case for liberty. When the legislative branch undermines the independence of the judiciary through the imposition of mandatory minimum sentences, I will be making the case for responsible government and the separation of powers. When the rights of property owners are violated by the very institutions created to protect them, through zoning laws, regulations, and green tape, you'll find me fighting for that most basic of human rights, private property. When both major parties push on with the disastrous war on drugs, using the police as a blunt force instrument in an attempt to arrest our way out of the problem, when the black market continues to thrive, enriching organised crime, while some of the state's most vulnerable, suffering from substance addiction, are treated like criminals rather than patients, I'll be making the case for policies that focus on harm reduction. Western Australia could learn a lot from places like Portugal, who've adopted a decriminalisation approach with profoundly positive results. When our most basic rights and freedoms are chipped away at on a daily basis through nanny state regulations and big government paternalism, while with smoking indoors banned, irrespective of the decisions of the property owner, with bicycle helmets mandatory, despite the rest of the world agreeing that they're really not worth the effort, with e-cigs, a potentially life-saving alternative pathway to quitting smoking, are practically banned, I'll be there making the case for personal choice and personal responsibility. When governments distort markets, creating perverse incentives through price fixing, restrictions on competition, and other market manipulation, I'll be there to make the case for free markets. When government spends money it doesn't have, passing the debt to our children to pay off. I'll be making the case for fiscal responsibility and good stewardship. When Western Australian businesses are doing it tough, straining under the burden of excessive regulation and high taxation, many struggling to cover payroll from month to month. While the major parties love to talk about economic growth and job creation, they seem to only offer vacuous rhetoric. They shy away from showing real political courage or testicular fortitude required to implement real reform that will provide an environment for businesses in the state to grow and to flourish. During my time in Parliament, I promise to continue to make the case for genuine economic reform. I will fight to slash red tape. I will fight to lower the tax burden on West Australian businesses. I look forward to working with my colleagues in this House to help make WA the most prosperous and business-friendly state in the country. Before I finish speaking, I'll take a moment to acknowledge some of those people who've helped me along the way. The WA branch of the Liberal Democrats, its members and its candidates, in particular Jared Neves and Andagjit Sangera, former branch president Connor Whittle and new branch president Stuart Hatch, David Lanhelm, Duncan Spender and Ellie Bernstein for their continued support. I'd like to thank my friends and family, in particular my grandfather, Sydney Stonehouse. He passed away several years ago. Sydney, or Pop as we knew him, was a role model for myself and my brothers. He was a stoic, principled, upright man. And while perhaps I didn't know him as well as I might have liked, I've always tried to live my life by the examples that he set. To live a life of honesty and integrity. So before you all today, I make the following commitment: that I will never compromise on my principles, that I will uphold the values of limited government, individual liberty, and lower taxes. I'll close now with what is perhaps my favourite quote from Thomas Jefferson. In matters of style, swim with the current. In matters of principle, stand like a rock. Thank you.
Congratulations, Anne.